Good evening and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Symposium. I'm Diane Sayre. Today is Friday, December 13th, and we will be talking about why poetry supersedes information. And this topic or direction of this topic was something very, very important to Lyndon LaRouche, who was an unrivaled economic forecaster and made fundamental discoveries about the relationship between man, the human mind, and the ongoing development of the universe, quite in contrary direction to what's normally taught in classrooms nowadays, or even many decades ago. Really, you could say things have been not going so well since the advent of Bertrand Russell and his linear approach to things. Now, I just wanted to share a little bit. I wrote in the invitation to the symposium a short quote from this book, The Science of Christian Economy, which is a collection of prison writings of LaRouche. One of the first little booklets he composed in prison was called What is Common Sense? And I'll just tell you how he starts. Perhaps there is some truth in the old saw that the grass is always greener in the other fellow's yard. During my 66 odd years, the people who praised common sense the longest and the loudest turned out to be the fellows who possessed very little of that particular virtue. The rest among us, watching those performances, were ashamed to defend common sense by its true name. Now it appears sometimes that common sense has about the same prospects as did the extinct dodo. This occasion appears to be our last opportunity to save it before our nation too might become extinct. Let us now at last defend it openly by its true name. To that end, let us construct agreement to a proper definition. We begin with two simple decisions. We should have no reluctance at throwing out all connotations of horse sense. The image of cleaning our living room carpets with a pitchfork improves our resolution on that account. It should be obvious that we must reject all definitions premised on axiomatically upon the notion of an individual person with the brains to survive. Societies may or may not be immortal. No individual is. And so he talks about the question of individual survival, momentary survival versus the ability of a society to not only survive, but develop in perpetuity. And he says, whatever common sense should mean, the included term common signifies that a society were unlikely to attain successful survival unless common sense were more or less commonplace. That is a view not inconsistent with an opinion expressed by some notable founders of our federal republic, and a certain quality of universal public education were indispensable to ensure future generations capable of preserving the freedoms which had then been won recently at such great peril and expense. So also, as we come into the 250th anniversary of the founding of the Republic of the United States of America, I think it's very important to reflect on why our nation was founded, what were the circumstances of the world in which people lived at that time, and what was its purpose, which we seem to be very far from today. Now, on the question of quote unquote common sense and survival, there's been a lot of talk these days about nuclear war. Now, I would say it should be common sense that no one survives a nuclear war. We saw what happened with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The weapons of today are much more advanced. We have thousands of nuclear warheads and weapons, and all of the war game scenarios where they play out what happens demonstrate that once the thing starts, everybody basically uses up everything they have. So it is quite bizarre that anyone, and this now includes Rear Admiral Thomas Buchanan at a meeting of CSIS, would make such bizarre comments as to say, he said, well, of course, we know a nuclear war can never be won and should never be fought. But if we have a nuclear war, shouldn't we plan to win it? Shouldn't we make sure we have weapons left over, that we don't deplete everything on the first round? Now, I'm hoping many of you are kind of hitting your head and saying, what? Not use up everything on the first round, have the weapons to fight another day? That is, if we're not reduced to just being a shadow on the sidewalk, like so many people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were, simply incinerated on impact. So how do we get people, one, out of this delusional fantasy world that of this kind of thinking, and two, to contemplate actually what mankind should rather be doing, which many people on the planet are moving toward. The majority of the world's population does not think it's acceptable or normal to withhold food, medicine, and necessities from civilian populations, as we see going on in Gaza, where you have an absolutely extraordinary death rate among children and women. The majority of the world doesn't think it's right to bomb hospitals and drop leaflets on double amputees and tell them they have 15 seconds to move or be bombed. Somehow that seems to be acceptable to people in the United States. The majority of the world doesn't think that we can talk about surviving a nuclear war. So Americans seem to have very little exposure, thanks to our mainstream wartime propaganda, to what is happening in the rest of the world. But we don't have to go there, and we don't have to even see videos of it. We can use our imagination, especially when presented with certain reports from others, or you can get a glimmer and begin to have an idea that there's a real change afoot. And there is a real change afoot. It's not clear whether we are going to survive or not at this time. What is clear is that things are not going to continue in this trajectory, because one way or another, either we're going to end up in a horrible catastrophe, or we're going to change the direction and do something better. So in that regard, I'm just going to turn it over to Bill Ferguson, a good friend of mine, longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche, known sometimes as the Bard of Boston for his brilliant, satirical, ironical lyrics to various songs for political rallies, and his poetry. So Bill, I'm glad to have you, and please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. In I believe it was 1983, Lynn wrote a paper called The Science of the Human Mind. And I recall the very last sentence of that paper where he says that truth only exists in the form of polemics against evil and falsehood. And if you look at LaRouche's work, his whole life is like a continuous war against information theory, systems analysis, empiricism, logical formalism, limits to growth, environmentalism, Malthusianism, and dozens of other isms that are just anti-human. There was a excerpt that of a speech LaRouche gave in '98, where he addresses the issue of human creativity that was part of the third panel from the conference on Sunday. Do we have that clip ready? Can we play that now?
the Greek classical art, unlike the archaic art, archaic Greek or archaic Egyptian, forces you to see an in-betweenness. For example, take the case in modern, a relatively modern classical art. Leonardo da Vinci did a famous painting, the Virgin of the Grotto, in which there are two sources of light depicted in the painting. One is the light of the sun, is another light equally strong. And therefore, in understanding this, when you look at this painting, the mind is forced to say, how do I reconcile what Leonardo did? It's like a world of two suns. One light, the sun, another light. And the two lights are defined in a very ingenious way. You find the same thing with Raphael Sanzio in the Vatican apartment, where he painted these famous frescoes. And you find that you have to stand in two positions to see the frescoes. You see one thing when you stand close to it at a certain distance, and you go another discrete distance away from it to see the thing as a whole. You see a different picture. The mind must put these two contradictory images together. You see the same thing in the museum with the so-called transfiguration of Raphael Sanzio. You look at it closely, you get one image. You stand back, you can see the transfiguration, a completely different image. The mind must put two things together. All art is based on that. This is called ideas, and that's what we want to get to here. Ideas. And go on to the next one. I'll come back to this just. You see, again, I've written it out and put it on this form. What the Greeks mean by an idea, and the difference between the archaic art represents a sense perception. The Greek classical art, or the paintings by Raphael or Leonardo da Vinci, represent ideas. There's a difference. One is an image based on the senses, which is what you get on television, isn't it? Television entertainment is based on no ideas, but sense perception, blood, violence, and sex. You see it, you feel it, you sense it. That's real. But it's not. Whereas an idea is something else. The term idea means a principle. For example, the common case of a principle is a scientific principle. The idea of gravity. Did you ever see a gravity? Did you ever actually feel one? No, you didn't. You may have thought you did. You didn't. Did you ever see a principle of nature? You ever shake hands with it, smell it, lick it, touch it, sniff it? No, you didn't. But these are ideas, and they are valid, and they tell us something. They tell us the principles control the universe. Something you can't smell, you can't see, you can't touch, you can't lick it, you can't taste it, and yet it controls the universe. It's called a principle. It's called an idea. All art, great art, is based on ideas, which have nothing to do directly with the senses. Artistic ideas come from contradictions in the senses. As classical art comes from dissonance, from contradictions, from the development of forcing you to find an idea, to find an irony, a metaphor, an idea. Scientific principle, ideas. Now let's look at this. This is where we get to the part about the difference between monkeys and people. Next one. There are 4 steps to forming an idea. And I've reduced it to the form which occurs in science. In science, you have, as we have this contradiction, this ontological paradox, this difference between the image of an economy from the standpoint of money, from the standpoint of financial accounting, which is fraudulent. But they still collect bills on that basis. Then you have the other conception of the economy, which is based on physical production and things which are essential to physical production, such as education, healthcare, and science service. So you have 2 images of the economy. The fact that the two somehow intersect means that there's an irony here, there's a contradiction, there's a metaphor. And you've got to explain that metaphor to understand how an economy works. There's another thing, is that you have a principle in so-called physics, or mathematical physics, called entropy, which says, in effect, that any mechanical system will run down. Now, if an economy is a mechanical system, and all financial accounting is based on mechanics, the principles of mechanical interaction, how can you have a financial system which generates a profit? How can it? Every system, mechanical system, if it continues long enough, runs down. Now, if something runs down, how does it produce more? Every mechanical system always produces less. Therefore, by definition, no economy which corresponds perfectly to a financial accounting system could possibly have a profit. And yet, if we look at the history of mankind, we find that mankind, whose potential population density on this planet, as approximating that of an ape, was only never more than 3 million people on this planet. If mankind were an ape, which is what Prince Philip claims to be, then at no time could there have been more than several million living human individuals on this planet in the past 2 million years of the Ice Age. At no time. That's the ecological potential of an ape or an ape-type species. How did we get to several hundred million people, living individuals on this planet, during the medieval period? How did we get to 5 billion people on this planet recently? Obviously, we're not apes. Obviously, we grow. This growth in population depended upon technological progress of various kinds, also artistic progress. Man's increase of power over nature. It depended upon the growth of income, standard of living, lessening morbidity rates. You can't educate a child at the age of 25 if the parents are dying of morbidity rates at the age of 30 to 35, can you? You can't maintain such a society. Therefore, there had to be more, there had to be improvement, there had to be increase. This is no entropic system, this is no mechanical system, this is no financial accounting system. It doesn't explain anything. There's some source of some increase of man's power over nature which intersects the process of production, which accounts for this progress.
So in honor of this principle that he's identifying, which is the essence of economics, which is the principle of the generation of new ideas that increase man's power over nature, I would like to recite a poem by Friedrich Schiller, an English translation, entitled Hope. People discuss it and dream on end of better days that are coming. After a golden and prosperous end, they are seen chasing and running. The world grows old and grows young in turn, yet doth man for betterment hope etern. 'Tis hope that guides him into life. Round the frolicsome youth doth it flutter. The youth is allured by its magic rife. It is not interred with the elder. Though he ends in the coffin his weary lope, yet upon that coffin he plants his hope. It is no empty fawning deceit begot in the brain of a jester. Proclaimed aloud in the heart it is. We were born for that which is better. And what the innermost voice conveys, the hoping spirit ne'er that betrays. Betterment, hope. I see that as correlating with this idea of mankind increasing potential relative population density, as LaRouche put it, as he developed in his Science of Economics. Now, can we go to slide number 1? Losing my screen here. Oh no, that's the next one. Okay. I don't know if you could see it very well, but when LaRouche was speaking, there was a chart up with this title that I basically reproduced the chart for this discussion. And I want to go through it because he kind of went through this rather quickly. Sense perception versus ideas. Anything which can be described as a fact experienced by means of the senses is not an idea. Ideas are principles of nature whose validity is proven by those methods which are typified by a successful scientific demonstration of an efficient physical principle. There are two classes of such ideas. The first are ideas corresponding to validated principles of physical science. The second are ideas corresponding to a proven principle of cognition. Could you go to the next slide, number 3? All right, and you heard him say, this is where we get to the part about the difference between monkeys and people. He basically has an outline of the creative process, which is also the process of metaphor. Step number 1, pose an ontological paradox. In other words, present two things that could stand as quote unquote facts, things that are true about the universe, but they contradict one another. And he says this is representable. You can state it in terms of language. Step 2, discover a validatable solution. You can't have contradictions in reality. If there's an actual, as he said, an idea is not a object of the senses. An idea is a principle that governs the universe. So it's beyond, above the senses. Now, the scientists that can create a new idea that resolves the contradiction, that increases mankind's power over nature. But that process cannot be represented in language. The idea, when he comes to the solution, it's in his head, but he can't put it in your head. He has to use ideas that you're already familiar with to get you to reconstruct that idea in your head. So that's what goes on in step number 2 is to discover the solution, which is not representable. It's inside of the discoverer. Now, step 3 is where you use the powers of metaphor, irony, contradiction to cause your audience, cause your fellow scientists, cause your fellow citizen to reconstruct the idea in their own minds. And then step number 4, you design a proof of principle experiment to show that it is an actual valid discovery that increases power over nature. Now, step number 2, that's what I want to focus on, because that's the uniquely human aspect. Well, that's what's uniquely human, period. And that's the driver of economy. Economy is the generation of these, the substance of economy is the generation, transmission, and assimilation of these new ideas. Now, let's back up to poetry. And when I speak of poetry, I'm going to put it forward as not just the use of meter and rhyme and language, but to symbolize this, to represent this principle of art in general, this principle of, as he put it, contradiction, paradox, irony. You could also say the principle of the Socratic dialogue. Socrates and Plato, they were the masters of poetry in the deepest sense. Now, Shelley, in Shelley's A Defense of Poetry, he describes poetry as addressing the powers of imagination rather than the powers of the understanding or the rational mind. And this is a very important when we're talking about discovery. I'll read a quote from another famous musician named Albert Einstein. He said in one context, Imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited to all we know and understand. Imagination encircles the world. Now, just one other thing about this, or a couple of things about this defensive poetry of Percy Shelley. LaRouche identifies it as having a profound impact on him as an adolescent. That document, A Defense of Poetry, spoke to his soul. Now, let's go to slide number 3. An example of this process of metaphor, irony, contradiction in science that LaRouche emphasized is Nicholas of Cous's treatment of Archimedes' quadrature of the circle. Quadrature meaning squaring the circle. Can you construct a square that has an area equal to the area of a circle? And the basic method is to circumscribe the circle with polygons and then inscribe a corresponding polygon inside the circle. And then if you add more sides to the inscribed and circumscribed polygons, the area of the circumscribed polygon gets smaller and smaller to the limit of the circle area, and the one inside gets bigger and bigger to the limit of the circle. And therefore you can get a very close approximation to the area of the circle. Please go to slide 4. In Cous's treatment, however, he uses a discussion of this process to illustrate a completely new idea. You see, you have this square inside of the circle, and it's labeled that the circle represents truth and the square represents intellect. A polygon of 2 to the second power sides, 4 sides. Obviously, there's a big gap between the intellect there as represented and the truth. Go to the next slide. So the first polygon we had was 2 to the second power, or 4. And now we have a polygon of 16 sides, which is 2 to the 4th power. So the circle, the inscribed polygon is a much closer approximation to the circle, but there is still a gap. Just as there's still a gap between the truth and the intellect. Now go to the next slide. This may be hard to see, but this is a representation focusing in on one side of a polygon. Remember, the other polygon, the first polygon was 4 sides. The second polygon was 16 sides. This polygon is 2 to the 16 power sides, which is 65,536 sides. And still there's a gap. Now, in terms of the content of the circle, the area, you're getting closer and closer and closer. But think about the difference between a circle and a polygon. A circle is one continuous, smooth action illustrating one principle, whereas a polygon is linear action and then an abrupt switch of direction, and then linear action and another abrupt switch, and it continues around. So the more sides you have, the polygon that has the most sides, it may seem to approximate the circle better, but it's actually becoming less and less a circle, further and further away from the circle. You can also look at the angle. The angle between the sides of the polygons gets larger and larger. Like and you see in this diagram, the angle between the 2 sides of the polygon, it's getting very, very close It's getting larger and larger to the limit of 180 degrees. But if you imagine it going to infinity, as they say, to the limit, then what happens? Then all of a sudden you're going from not a polygon with an infinite number of sides, but once that angle becomes 180 degrees, then that circle becomes a straight line, the exact opposite of the circle, or so it would seem. Now, this is a treatment. This treatment of the quadrature of the circle is a metaphor for a founding tract of science entitled On Learned Ignorance, which is a very ironical title. And I would say that it's addressing the powers of the imagination, as opposed to what we would call, or what could be called, the intellect or the rational faculty, the reasoning that we associate with logic, or logical deduction from assumed axioms and postulates, like what's in a textbook, things that our experiences told us to be true, and then we reason from them to conclude further truths and make predictions of what we'll see. Now that is very useful and necessary to do, but it doesn't create new ideas, and it does not resolve contradictions that lead to new breakthroughs. That's what's unique about the human species, that we can change our ideas, create a higher idea, and move up to a higher level of development. And that's the power of the imagination. I remember the first time I tried to read On Learned Ignorance, I was completely lost. I didn't know what I was dealing with. But then there was a period of a few months where I worked a lot in terms of reading and memorizing and reciting Shakespeare sonnets. And then I come back to Cusa, and then I realized that that it's addressing the same powers of the mind. So if you ever take up, and I hope you will, take up this fundamental work of the founding of science, On Learned Ignorance, keep that in mind. Now, can we go to the next slide? Let's see, slide number 7. Okay. Now, this is a chart representing the process of black body radiation. This is a physical problem. Just to give you an example of this situation of contradictions. And this became a focus of interest in physics in the late 1800s, especially in Germany. Now, this is just some historical context. Bernhard Riemann in 1854 had written his paper on the hypotheses that underlie geometry, where he basically states that building a geometry of space on the basis of axioms and postulates of Euclid, or axioms and postulates that contradict Euclid, that's all that's existed in terms of our ideas of space. And he says that we can no longer tolerate that in order to make progress, right at the end, he says, we have to view geometry not as a axiomatic deductive system, but we have to base our analysis of geometry and space on the experimental reality. In other words, not axiomatic deductive formalism. Or as he says, this leads us into another realm, that of physics, which this current occasion does not allow us to enter. Now, that was a revolutionary statement of scientific method, which was viciously attacked by Bertrand Russell, the great peace activist whom LaRouche described as the most evil man of the 20th century. Bertrand Russell's reaction to Bernhard Riemann, was to say that there are no geometries, there are no fictitious geometries that we have to pay any attention to. And he embarked on a program, and this is along with David Hilbert and others, to reduce science to mathematics, to try to completely formalize and reduce all truths of physics into the form of mathematics, and to further reduce mathematics to logic. Basically, how the operations of rules of how symbols relate to one another. He wrote this paper called Principia Mathematica, which was a nod to Isaac Newton, another person who wasn't a fan of hypotheses. In other words, they were trying to eliminate creativity. And people like Bertrand Russell, they stated that everything fundamental about science has already been discovered. All we need to do is some experiments and refine some details and, you know, get better figures on physical constants here and there. But there's nothing fundamental that we don't know. But then you have this problem with black body radiation, which is basically, what is the intensity of radiation at different wavelengths from a body as it is heated? And you can approximate it with a container that has a small aperture from which radiation is emitted. And this was a very important problem in thermodynamics. This curve represents the experimental results of some precise experiments that were done. Basically, you have the y-axis is the intensity of electromagnetic radiation correlated with different wavelengths of light, and each of those curves represents that function for a different level of temperature. Now, classical physics, or as it was known, thermodynamics at the time, or actually, this is about radiation of the thermal radiation at different temperatures. Now, what classical physics said was that if you applied the methods that were known at the time, those curves wouldn't go up and down like that. The methods they had were very accurate. There was one analysis that was very accurate at low wavelengths, and then but completely off at the higher wavelengths. And then there was another that was better at the higher wavelengths, but off on the lower ones. And then there was this phenomenon of the ultraviolet catastrophe, which would basically said that according to the classical physics, as was known in the late 1800s, there would be an infinite amount of energy at the higher wavelengths, so the whole universe would be fried. Now, this obviously wasn't true. Now, Max Planck, who's another great German musician as well as a physicist, he took on this problem. And being a master of mathematics applied to physics, he was able, this curve, by the way, this curve is generated by experimental data. So he, as a theoretical physicist, he had to come up with a solution to come up with a mathematical relation to explain these curves that would correlate to these curves. And he was able to do it very successfully. But in order to do it, he had to make what seemed to him kind of ridiculous assumption, which was that energy didn't exist as a continuous wave, but it had a particulate form to it, that it came in packets or quanta. That physical principle would generate the mathematical curve which had been presented by experiment. So the experiments contradicted the formal axiomatic system, or the textbook, if you will, of classical physics in 1890, 1899. So then Max Planck says, well, in order for this curve to be explained in terms of physics, we have to assume that energy is particulate. It comes in packets, discrete packets. And this is how the idea of the quantum of least action was first discovered. But he didn't take it, he didn't believe it. He thought it was just a provisional step. Then we come to the other German musician that I mentioned before, Albert Einstein. He applied this principle. He's saying, wait a minute, this isn't a mathematical device. If we consider energy, electromagnetic energy, as being quantized in packets, then this explains the phenomenon of the photoelectric effect, where if you expose a high frequency light onto a metal plate, it becomes charged. In other words, the electromagnetic energy knocks electrons out of their shells, and then they're loose on the surface of the metal. He was able to explain that with this quantum theory, which was only artifice. So here what you had the contradictions of the ultraviolet catastrophe in the black body radiation theory. And then you had this photoelectric effect. But in this process, you had a complete revolution in physics. This idea of quantization of energy. And then we also know that another contradiction. I don't have an illustration for you, but I'm sure you're familiar with it. Einstein in 1905, the same year he published his paper on the photoelectric effect, he published his paper on special relativity, which was based on another contradiction between the general relativity of motion and the constancy of the speed of light. We can talk a little bit more about that later if we have time, but the point is you had these anomalies, things that are absolutely true about the universe, but they contradict one another. And his resolution led to this, what's known as the special theory of relativity. And you may recall, obviously, everyone knows that you've heard of the famous E equals mc squared, that a mass has an energy content proportional times the speed of light squared. And of course, we know that this is one of the ideas that led to the development of nuclear energy and, unfortunately, the nuclear bombs that we're concerned with right now. So to come to a certain point here, Bertrand Russell and company said science is basically over. We're just got to fill in some details. And then a few years after he's stated that, and is in the process of trying to embalm the corpse of science, Max Planck and Albert Einstein, these two German musicians, completely revolutionized physics. And as a result of it, we have a technology that could end poverty worldwide. Now here's the irony, right? These musicians created this new revolutionary theory, and it has been applied. But we're in a situation now. Could you go to the next slide? Okay, that's a representation of a nuclear power plant. This is the energy that could end poverty, end scarcity. There's 600 million people in Africa that have no electricity, no access to electricity. This could solve the problem. And this is a technology that's existed for, 70 years, even longer than that. Now go to the next slide. That's Hiroshima. That's another application of this nuclear technology. So hearkening back to the issue of, which way are we going to go? I'm going to read this quote. Well, I'm not going to read it. This quote from Julius Caesar. That's the slide number 0, Dave, if you want to go back to it. There is a tide in the affairs of men which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat. And we must take the current when it serves, or lose our ventures. We're definitely at that point right now. And we have to make a decision. Could you go back to the slide of the power plant? We have to make a decision. If we go with the 10 principles of a new security and development architecture, then we can have that slide. If we don't adopt that perspective, we're going to get the next slide. On a massive scale. Now, let me just, to wrap up, this shows you the cultural problem. Since the breakthroughs of Einstein and Planck and the applications and all the development that's occurred since then, where do we stand now? The United States has 5,044 nuclear warheads. Each one of them can kill tens of thousands or even millions of people. We only have 93 nuclear reactors generating electricity. So we have 54 times more weapons of mass destruction based on nuclear technology than we do nuclear reactors generating electricity for the progress of mankind. I think this makes a point about the issue of successful survival, as Diane was speaking of. So let's take the current while it serves.
Thank you. And which kind of current is that?
Oh, well, it will be alternating current.
I think this was really wonderful. I hope people followed. I particularly like looking at the Archimedes attempt to square the circle because it's very ticklish. And in other words, somehow if you remain in these lines, these just adding angles, adding lines, you can never you just can't get there. And so the circle is a new idea coming from somewhere else, although the circle can order the principle of your lines. And I say that because Helga made a point yesterday, I guess, in her webcast about, or no, this morning in the International Peace Coalition call about what Putin has done with the Orezhnik missile, which travels at Mach 10 or higher. I was looking at a report today that said at the point that it struck the target, it was at Mach maybe 11.8 or something, 4 kilometers per second. Enormous speed. And Putin made the point that this missile transcends the need for nuclear weapons. That what he's done by encouraging the development of this technology is of in the same species as what Lyndon LaRouche was working on with the laser defense. That is, if you take a linear kind of thinking, like the arm wrestling approach or something, then the more strength, the more brute force you have, you win. And you just keep adding more and more and more and more force. And of course, there's certain boundary conditions where it doesn't work anymore, but that's sort of a bad infinity well, you kill 50 of our people, we're going to kill 60 of your people, and then you kill 70, then we kill 8. There is no victory. That kind of game ends with everyone dying, like a nuclear war. But if you come up with a technology, this missile goes so fast that no one has the technology to be able to stop it from hitting its target, which changes the entire configuration on the question of deterrence. And it actually is a major game changer. And we seem here in our Neanderthalic way of thinking to have gotten very far behind in some of these advances. But what are your thoughts on this? And maybe you can explain it better than I just did, but I think this is really fascinating and very optimistic, actually.
Well, I have the image of a elementary school teacher separating two boys fighting. Use your words. Helga's often used the image of humanity being in its adolescence, that wars and injustice are like childhood diseases. And once mankind reaches maturity, we'll be beyond such things. And I think that's an important way to look at it. I'll just say one other thing about this issue of the imagination. I mean, it's when I say imagination, like when it's applied by someone like Einstein or Planck or Kuza or Socrates or LaRouche, it's not a fantasy. It's you specify what are the conditions that I'm trying to imagine to create. What are the conditions that are going to satisfy? Like, for example, what are the conditions that would satisfy and resolve this contradiction that I've discovered? So it's rigorous in the sense that it is to apply to the real world, but it is absolutely independent of the system of knowledge as typified in the textbook. We've definitely taken a wrong turn in culture. I mean, it's happened, well, especially in Western civilization. I mean, if you think about the country that created the Florentine Renaissance, the country that created the Beethoven, Mozart, Schiller, the country of the École Polytechnique of Joan of Arc, the first nation state, they all went fascist in the 20th century and almost brought the world to complete destruction. All those cultures were subverted. And look at us in the United States. We've become the opposite. We've become what we fought against. We've become an empire. I mean, I should mention, you could read in the 80s, there were all these analyses of the fact that by the time a child was 18, they had witnessed 10,000 simulated homicides on television and movies. But that was just the 80s. By the year 2000, you had them as their recreation practicing homicide with video games. And Mrs. LaRouche addressed that in the year 2000 in her presentation. I forget the title right now, where she said that, we're creating little monsters. You remember Pokemon, Pocket Monsters? Well, that's what we're turning the kids to. And that was 25 years ago. So we're reaping what we've sown. Now, we do have to begin to reverse that. That's why I titled my presentation, Poetry Must Begin to Supersede Information. And we've got to do it very quickly.
I agree. It's also the case that sometimes the brilliant insight of someone else or a breakthrough, it happened with Sputnik, in the United States, a kind of kick in the ass, where people suddenly decide maybe they better do something differently than what they were doing before. Or, you have this, when you travel or see images of some of the infrastructure being built in China, it is a good wake-up call, because you say, well, why aren't we doing this? They have trains that go 350 miles an hour or 350 kilometers an hour. And the average freight train in the US goes 17 miles an hour. Then you begin to, well, what is stopping us? Clearly, what's stopping us is not physics. What's stopping us is mental.
Well, again, on this issue of imagination, one important aspect of imagination is to be able to put yourself in the mind of someone else. True empathy, recognizing the humanity in every person, every single person. An actual human economy would be based on the idea that the priority of the economy, it wouldn't be like in the economics textbooks I've read. It's not about Adam Smith. It's not about buying cheap and selling dear. It's not about pursuing the seeking of pleasure and the avoiding of pain, but it's actually about fostering the powers of human creativity in every person, to enable every child to have the opportunity, all the physical material needs satisfied, so that they can focus their youth on developing their human capabilities, whether it is in music or art or in science or some other noble, worthwhile pursuit. And so many people are denied that. And I think it goes directly into this cultural question. Why do we, what's happened to our empathy? And we need to get back to that. I mean, how can we tolerate what we see coming from Gaza? We have to. Well, it has to be addressed, and I think like anybody that's seen the discourse that occurred in the course of the recent presidential campaigns knows that there is a big problem. What passes for dialogue, what passes for political discussion, it lacks empathy, it lacks insight. That's why I think it's so important that we that the Schiller Institute published the development drive, means no war, no migration, that there's a future. It satisfies the conditions that, like LaRouche saw the situation we were talking about, the confrontation between the United States, Soviet Union with nuclear weapons, a solution that deals with the weapons, but it also deals with the necessity for rapid economic development and creating the material conditions for progress of all humanity. If that had been implemented in the 1980s, we would not be in this mess. But he didn't stop with that. The Oasis Plan, same thing. The shared economic benefit of your children and grandchildren has to be the priority for the Israelis and the Palestinians. Otherwise, there's no future. Just like, and then if we look at the confrontation between the Western countries, the NATO countries, and say the BRICS countries. I mean, there's no reason for that. It's not reason. We've got to. It has to be recognized that there's a reductio ad absurdum there. If the United States and Russia and China cannot live in the world in harmony, as the Chinese are constantly emphasizing win-win cooperation. If we can't do that, then we're doomed. Sooner or later, the missiles will fly. Perhaps they should rename the attackums the attack us, because that seems to be the result.
That's true. That's true. So I think we've come to the end of our hour. I would like to let everyone know and remind people that this Sunday afternoon at 4:30 p.m., the chorus that I founded 10 years ago this year, the Schiller Institute NYC Chorus, is holding a concert in New York City. It's in person in New York City, and it's online. And you can visit the Schiller Institute website, Schiller Institute NYC Chorus, which is SINYC, and then the word chorus, CHORUS.com, to find out information. It's 4:30 p.m. If you're in the city, it's at the Good Shepherd Faith Presbyterian Church at 152 West 66th Street. If you are watching from afar online, if you visit the chorus website or YouTube channel, I think you can find information on it there. And I think it will be part of the way to addressing what Bill and I have just been discussing, which is to liberate your imagination, to make sensuous what is generally not sensed in the physical domain by participating in something beautiful. So I hope everyone who's watching can come to the concert, watch it online. Thank you for being here. Yes,
Diane,
go ahead.
I had one more poem I wanted to share.
Great.
Can we do that?
Mm-hmm.
This is addressing the true nature of the human species. But be contented when that fell arrest, without all bail, shall carry me away. My life hath in this line some interest, which for memorial still with thee shall stay. When thou reviewest this, thou dost review the very part was consecrate to thee. The earth can have but earth, which is his due. My spirit is thine, the better part of me. So then thou hast but lost the dregs of life, the prey of worms, my body being dead. The coward conquest of a wretch's knife, too base of thee to be remembered. The worth of that is that which it contains, and that is this, and this with thee remains.
Great. Thank you. So with that, I think we shall conclude, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.